Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're kicking off something really important if you're gearing up for your CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam. This is the start of our dedicated CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series, our mission. Pretty simple, actually. We want to arm you with the key knowledge you need to, well, ace that exam. We're going to tackle multi-choice questions head-on, but it's not just about memorizing answers. We want you to really get the concepts, build that solid understanding, that confidence, both for the test and, out there on the job.
That's absolutely the heart of it. Passing is one thing, but really understanding the principles behind welding, knowing the why, not just the what. That's what makes a truly great inspector. We're hoping to connect those dots for you today, theory to practice, help you get those aha moments.
Exactly. So think of these questions we're about to go through as a bit of a challenge for yourself, a chance to see where you're at, and then we'll dive in together to deepen that knowledge. We'll unpack everything, break it down, make sure you leave feeling clear, ready to sharpen those skills. Let's get started. Okay, first up, let's tackle a real fundamental concept in manual metal arc welding, MMA, a process I'm sure many of you know well. So here's the question. In an MMA welding process, which of these statements holds true? In arc gap, which stays almost constant even if the welder shifts the electrode position slightly. B, a voltage, which stays almost constant even if the welder varies the arc gap. C, a current, which stays almost constant even if the welder varies the arc gap. D, both A and B. All right, take a second. Think about how MMA actually works out there with a real power source.
Okay, the correct answer you're looking for is C, a current, which remains almost constant even if the welder varies the arc gap. This is really fundamental to MMA. You see, MMA uses what we call a constant current power source, CC for short. And these machines, they're specifically designed to keep pumping out a stable, consistent current. Now think about it. When you're welding manually, nobody's hand is perfectly robot steady, right? There are always going to be tiny little variations in that distance, the arc gap. If the current jumped around like crazy with every little wobble, getting a decent weld would be, well, incredibly tough. So instead, the CC power source lets the voltage change. If your arc gap gets a bit longer, voltage goes up to keep the current flowing. Gap gets shorter, voltage drops, this sort of adapting. Voltage makes MMA pretty forgiving for the welder. It helps keep the heat input steady, leading to a more uniform weld, even with those minor hand movements.
Right, that makes perfect sense for consistency. So it's forgiving, the current stays stable, but does that constant current thing have any, downsides? Or maybe situations where an inspector needs to be extra watchful because the voltage is doing all the compensating?
Oh, that's a really good point. It gets into the finer details. While that stable current is great for control, the changing voltage, yeah, it can mean less precise control at the extremes. For instance, if a welder lets that arc gap get way too long, the voltage can spike pretty high. You might get a really harsh arc, hard to handle, or it might just go out. And the opposite, arc gap too short, voltage plummets. You might get the electrode sticking to the workpiece. Well, so yeah, as an inspector, you still got to watch the welder's technique. Are they maintaining a reasonably consistent arc length? Because even with the machine helping on current, really poor arc length control will cause problems. Porosity, spatter, maybe an uneven bead. It's definitely a balance.
Fascinating. So helpful tech, but definitely not a replacement for good technique. Okay, let's shift gears. Moving from the process itself to the material we're welding, steel. What is it that really gives steel its strength, its backbone? Specifically, which element in steel has the greatest effect on its hardness? Your options are A, chromium.B, manganese.C, carbon D, nickel.
Right, this one's pretty fundamental. The answer is C, carbon. Without a shadow of a doubt, carbon is the main element controlling how hard and strong steel is. To kind of picture why, think about steel at the atomic level. It's mostly iron, right? An iron crystal structure, like a grid. Now, carbon atoms are much smaller than iron atoms. They squeeze into the little gaps, the spaces between the iron atoms in that grid.
Hold on, you mentioned dislocations before we started recording. That sounds pretty technical. Could you maybe give us a quick, simple idea of what a dislocation is and why carbon messing with them makes steel hard? For anyone who might be a bit fuzzy on their basic metallurgy.
Yeah, good call. Think of dislocations as tiny imperfections or wrinkles in that perfect grid of iron atoms. It's natural, they're always there. When you try to bend or stretch metal, it's actually these wrinkles, these dislocations, that allow the layers of atoms to sort of slide past each other. That's what lets the metal deform. Now, carbon atoms act like tiny little obstacles, like microscopic speed bumps or wedges. They get stuck in or near these dislocations and basically stop them from moving easily. If the dislocations can't move, the atoms can't slide, the metal resists deformation much more strongly. And that makes it harder and stronger. And, heat treatments like quenching, They work by trapping those carbon atoms in very specific, highly stressed positions, making things even harder, creating structures like martensite, which is why you often need tempering afterwards to regain some toughness.
Microscopic speed bumps. Love that analogy. Makes it really clear. So knowing that, what's a common mistake an inspector might make if they sort of underestimate the impact of carbon content? Or maybe a surprising scenario where it pops up.
Oh, a classic one is definitely underestimating preheat needs. Higher carbon steel, or steel with a higher carbon equivalent value, is much more susceptible to hydrogen cracking, especially thicker sections. Why? Because it hardens more readily on cooling. So an inspector might look at a WPS, see preheat temperature, maybe approve it based on a similar looking steel. But if the actual material being welded has just slightly higher carbon, you could end up with cracking after welding, even if everything else seemed okay. Other places, repairs, welding on a high carbon component without the right heat treatment controls. You could create a super hard, brittle, heat affected zone right next to the weld. Looks fine maybe, but it's a failure waiting to happen. That one little element, huge impact.
Wow, it really does cascade through the whole process. Okay, let's move on. Let's tackle a technique challenge now. Travel speed. Seems basic, right? Just how fast you move the torch. But get it wrong. Big problems. So what happens if your travel speed is too fast? A, if too fast may cause low toughness, slag inclusions, and cap undercut. B, if too fast may cause high hardness, slag inclusions, and a narrow, thin weld bead. C, if too slow may cause high hardness, excessive deposition, and cold lapse.
D, none of the above.
Okay, the description that really nails the consequences of going too fast is B. It may cause high hardness, slag inclusions, and a narrow, thin weld bead. Let's break that down. When you move too quickly, you're putting less heat into the weld zone per inch or per millimeter of travel. Less heat input means the weld pool cools down faster, much faster. And rapid cooling, especially in steels that are sensitive to it, can cause those harder microstructures we just talked about, finer grains, maybe even some martensite. So higher hardness, often meaning lower toughness, which isn't usually what you want. Then slag inclusions. If you're using a process like MMA or flux cord that produces slag, moving too fast just doesn't give the molten slag enough time to float up to the top of the weld pool before the metal freezes. So bits of slag get trapped inside the weld. Not good. And finally, the narrow, thin bead. That's almost intuitive, right? If you race along, you're just not depositing as much filler metal in any given spot. So the resulting weld bead is smaller, narrower, maybe thinner than the design calls for. Could mean weak reinforcement or even incomplete fusion at the root.
That's like a complete diagnostic checklist right there, from just one parameter being off. Can you think of a time, maybe on a job site, where you saw that narrow bead or trapped slag and just knew, the welder's going too fast, and what needed to happen next?
Oh yeah, happens all the time. I remember insecting some structural steel fillet welds on a beam connection, and I saw a whole run of welds that were noticeably thin, kind of ropey looking, and you could see little dark lines, especially near the edges, the toes of the weld. Classic sign of excessive travel speed. The rapid cooling was probably causing some hardness issues too, and those dark lines were trapped slag. The welder was likely trying to boost productivity, get the job done quicker, the fix, how to get them to slow down that travel speed, maybe adjust the current slightly to compensate, ensure proper heat input, give that weld pool time to form correctly, let the slag float out. It's a textbook case. The visual clues told the whole story about technique.
Really brings it home. Okay, let's shift again, this time to process terminology. We often hear manual, semi-automatic, automatic. Let's clarify one of those. Which of the following best describes a semi-automatic welding process? A, the welder is responsible for maintaining the arc gap and travel speed. B, the welder is responsible for travel speed only. Arc gap is kept constant by the welding plant. C, both travel speed and arc gap is controlled by the welding plant. D, all of the above.
All right, the best fit here, the definition for semi-automatic is B. The welder is responsible for travel speed only. The arc gap is kept constant by the welding plant. That's the real differentiator. Think MIG-MAG or flux cord welding. These are your typical semi-automatic processes. The machine has a wire feeder, right? It pushes the electrode wire out at a set speed. Because that wire feed speed is constant, the distance from the wire tip to the workpiece, the arc gap or arc length, is automatically maintained by the machine's settings, specifically the relationship between wire feed speed and voltage. So what's the human operator doing? They're holding the torch and guiding it along the joint. Their main job is controlling the travel speed, how fast the weld progresses along the seam, and that's why it's semi-automatic. It's not fully manual like MMA, where the welder controls everything, feeding the rod, maintaining the arc, and it's not fully automatic, where a machine like a robot or a tractor controls both the torch movement, travel speed, and keeps the arc parameters stable. This setup, this division of labor, is why semi-automatic processes are generally much faster, more productive than manual welding. But the welder still has crucial control over where the weld goes and how fast.
That makes sense. That division of labor seems like a good balance for getting work done efficiently. But what's a common misunderstanding about semi-auto processes? Maybe a trap an inspector might fall into when they're watching one in action.
Yeah, a common trap is thinking, oh, the machine controls the arc length, so it must be easier to get a good weld. Or maybe assuming any problems are purely down to the equipment settings. But while the machine handles arc length, the welder's technique, how steadily they travel, the angle they hold the torch, any weaving motion they use, that stuff is still incredibly critical for the final quality. I've definitely seen situations where maybe an inspector jumps to blaming the wire feeder settings when the real issue was, say, the welder moving erratically or holding the torch at the wrong angle. That can cause lack of fusion, porosity, undercut things, still very much under the operator's control. So you, as the inspector, you've got to watch the person just as closely as you check the machine parameters.
That's really insightful. Okay, last question for this deep dive. Let's get specific about a process and material combination. This really shows how material behavior drives process choices. When TIG welding aluminum, which current type is generally the go-to choice? A, for the welding of aluminum, a DC negative current is preferred. B, for the welding of aluminum, a DC positive current is preferred. C, for the welding of aluminum, an AC is preferred. D, all of the above.
Okay, for TIG welding aluminum, the standard preferred current is C, AC, alternating current. And there's a very specific, very important reason for this, all down to aluminum's pesky oxide layer. Aluminum, you see, instantly forms this thin layer of aluminum oxide on its surface when exposed to air. Now, this oxide layer is tough, it's non-conductive, and crucially, it melts at a much higher temperature, like over 2,000 degrees C, compared to the aluminum metal underneath, which melts around 660 C. You have to break through or remove that oxide to get a proper weld. AC current is perfect for this because it switches back and forth, right, between positive and negative polarity. During the electrode positive half of the cycle, that's reverse polarity, electrons flow from the workpiece to the tungsten electrode. This electron flow actually bombards and breaks up that surface oxide layer. We call it the cleaning action, absolutely essential. But this part of the cycle puts a lot of heat onto the electrode itself. Then, during the electrode negative half, straight polarity, electrons flow the other way, from the electrode to the workpiece. This puts more heat into the base metal, giving you good penetration and forming the weld pool. But this half doesn't do the cleaning. So by alternating rapidly between these two, positive and negative AC, gives you both the cleaning action needed to remove the oxide and the focused heat needed for good penetration without melting your tungsten electrode. Using DC negative, no cleaning, DC positive, melts the electrode, poor penetration. AC is really the only practical choice for quality TIG on aluminum.
Wow, it's amazing how the electrical cycle is perfectly matched to solve that material chemistry problem.
Yeah.
What's the most, let's say, obvious sign of failure if someone tries to ignore that and use the wrong current, say DC negative? On aluminum, what would an inspector see immediately?
Oh, it's usually pretty ugly and obvious if someone tries DC negative. The biggest giveaway is a really dirty, contaminated-looking weld. You'll see dark, sooty deposits, maybe gray scum on the surface. That's basically the oxide layer not being broken down. The weld bead itself will often look like it's just sitting on top of the aluminum, not fused into it properly. It might be tall, ropey, with poor wetting at the edges, because that oxide layer is preventing the molten aluminum underneath from flowing and mixing correctly. It looks wrong. Very poor fusion, very low strength, almost guaranteed to fail. A huge red flag for any inspector.
Definitely a clear visual cue there. Okay, wow. We've really covered some ground today in this first CSWIP 3.1 exam prep deep dive. We started with the electrical characteristics of MMA, that constant current idea. Then we dug into steel, why carbon is king for hardness. After that, the effects of travel speed, too fast, too slow. We clarify what makes a process semi-automatic, and just finished with the specifics of AC for TIG welding aluminum. Quite a range.
It really is. And the key thing to remember is that these aren't just separate facts for the exam. They're all interconnected. Understanding the power source helps you understand technique issues. Knowing about carbon helps you understand heat treatment and weldability. It all builds together. Each bit of knowledge makes you a stronger, more perceptive inspector. You start seeing the links between the procedure, the material, the technique, and the final quality.
Spot on. So as you continue studying, as you build your career as an inspector, maybe chew on this thought. How does really mastering these core principles go beyond just passing the test? How could it fundamentally change how you diagnose problems on site, how you assure quality, maybe even how you contribute to finding better ways to weld on future projects? That's the real value of diving deep. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll catch you on the next one.